Welcome, guys. This is the AP Biology Chapter 22 lecture. You can see on the screen we're talking about Darwin's view of descent with modification. So how did the diversity of life originate? That's what this is really about here in this whole unit and definitely in this chapter. So how did we get all of the diversity of life that we see on Earth today? The biological and the scientific explanation to that question is through the process of evolution. It is big idea number one. That's our most important idea of the whole year here in AP Bio. So we're going to get really deep. This chapter is just covering the beginnings and really reviewing things you should have learned as freshmen. So evolution is the sum of the processes that have transformed life on Earth from whatever it was at the beginning to today's diversity. Most pervasive principle in biology. We've been talking about it all year long. I think some of these connections hopefully will start to come out as we work through this unit. So we need to think about big T theory versus little t theory. Big T theory, hypothesis supported repeatedly by data, makes testable predictions. We've seen some stuff out there here recently about climate change predictions and how they're science fiction. They're not science. Well, science requires theories and ideas to make predictions that we can then verify, yes, that did happen, so this theory must be true, or no, that did not happen, so this theory needs some modification. Little t theory is the layman's use of the word, I have a theory as to why those two broke up. Well, that's a guess. It's probably not been tested vigorously. So make sure that you understand that when I say theory, I mean a big T theory. Evolution is a theory. Cell theory is a theory. Big Bang is a theory. Atomic theory. Theory of gravity. Theory of evolution. Part of what we need to talk through is kind of the ideas that shaped evolution. So kind of the evolution of evolution. It does demonstrate science as a process really well. We've talked about spontaneous generation and how that case study went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. This is one that's really common on the AP exam. Again, it shows how science works when it works well. So you need to be able to make sure that you can summarize what each of these scientists said, and really you need to be able to put it into the context of how it influenced Darwin and his ideas that we've sort of settled on as how it must work. So there are a few pre-Darwinian views. Your book does a really good job of discussing these ideas. I'm going to run quickly through them here. In terms of Greeks, Plato and Aristotle, Plato said, man, look at how well things fit their environments. Things are adapted perfectly for their environment. So there must have been a creator that made every organism perfectly fit its environment. Aristotle added the scale of life idea that there were simple organisms and more complex organisms. But the result is life's already perfectly suited to its environment. Things don't need to change. There is no evolution. All the rungs on life's ladder are already occupied. That's kind of an old metaphor that used to be used, kind of been replaced by the tree of life, but those sorts of things. That led to the fixed species concept, that there was a creator that designed each and every species for one specific purpose. So horses were horses, frogs were frogs. They don't change. They are what they are. Again, no evolution. A creative viewpoint that all species could be identified and named, which is where Linnaeus came up with his naming system. The Linnaean naming system, where we get binomial nomenclature and all that kind of stuff. So then we move on to catastrophism, which I often mispronounce, and that was looking at the fossil record and trying to relate it to current life. Cuvier saw that there were some things that were in the fossil record that don't exist anymore. And so Cuvier said, okay, well, maybe things can go away. We can lose species due to catastrophe, but we can't gain any new ones. Certainly it makes sense that if there's the Great Flood fit in with these folks' belief system, so it seemed logical that a bunch of organisms could die off. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we can create new species or that new species can be created. Remember, at this point, we the Earth is assumed to be on the order of a few thousand years old. So the time scale that it would take for evolution to happen just wasn't imagined yet. Well, then James Hutton came along and discussed gradualism. And he essentially was talking about things like the Grand Canyon. This really big thing can be created a little piece at a time, essentially one grain of dirt at a time. This river can move through this soil, can carry sediment with it, and can gradually over time carve out something as dramatic as the Grand Canyon. But again, that takes a crazy amount of time. So Charles Lyell took his gradualism and, took gradualism from James Hutton and incorporated it into this theory called Uniformitarianism, which is essentially saying that what is happening now has always happened at the same rate. Now, we know right now that the climate is changing faster than it has in the past. So we know that uniformitarianism today is not true. But Lyell, again, is looking at the Grand Canyon and saying, okay, so the rate of flow or the rate of erosion has not changed over time. It's just been doing it for a really, really long time. It's not slowing down. It's not speeding up. It's doing the same things that it's been doing. The Earth has been doing the same things for a really long time. This sort of shows kind of the opposite of that, where rivers bring sediment to the ocean. We build up layers. Then sea levels change, and now we have layers that show strata or stripes that are the layers that were at the bottom of the ocean. Sort of explains why we have ocean creatures here in Indiana. At one point in time, we were buried underwater. So the result of all this is that the Earth must be very, very old, significantly older than the 6,000 years, based on the fixed species concept, and that these slow and subtle processes can cause substantial change. And remember, these guys are applying these ideas just to the Earth and geology, not to life and biology. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck in 1809 says, well, things appear to be changing. Some living organisms appear to be different than what their ancestors were. Things appear to be changing over time. So he said that the fossils were the remains of past life forms, and evolution did occur. These organisms are changing over time. So he said there were two mechanisms that we were able to adapt and change as a population. Lamarck said we can use things, and those body parts become stronger and larger. That's why we lift weights, right? That's why we work out. Body parts that we use to survive and that we exercise get bigger and stronger. Body parts that we don't use get weaker and weaker and smaller. So step 2 of Lamarck's theory is that these things are called acquired characteristics. So these modifications that are acquired by use or disuse can then be passed on to the offspring. Lamarck talked about giraffes, and he said that if there's a horse that needs to stretch its neck and reach leaves that are high up in a tree, it can do that. And over time, as you stretch, you become more flexible, so your neck gets longer. Then when you have offspring, that longer neck gets passed on to your kid, and then your kid stretches his neck out a little bit longer, and over time, gradually, our traits change. Kind of a sillier example that will be burned into your skull is these two have several acquired characteristics. They're muscular. They're orange from fake tanning. Let's focus on those two. So if Lamarck's theories on acquired characteristics were true, if these two had a baby, their baby would come out all muscular and orange. Because those are traits that these folks have acquired. They have developed more muscle mass than the average person, and their skin has turned a beautiful shade of orange. The problem is that now we know about genetics, and we know that orangeness and to a certain extent muscular definition is not a genetic trait. Those are not genetic traits. I apologize for my poor grammar there. But those aren't genetic traits. So now we know that acquired characteristics just can't be the mechanism that allows life to change over time. But to Lamarck's credit, he did suggest, he identified the role of fossils in evolution. He did suggest that adaptation to the environment is the primary cause of evolution. So he was heading in the right direction. He just didn't have the details worked out right. So then we come across Thomas Malthus, who is not a scientist. He's a guy that is an economist, and he's looking at human population growth. And he's saying, look, we're soon going to have more people than we can feed. So some people are going to survive, and some people aren't. The people that survive, the next generation is going to be a lot like them. We're going to lose out on poor people and farmers and factory workers and things along those lines. Of course, we're pre-industrial revolution here, so we're not talking about too many factory workers. But he's talking about essentially a war between the classes developing because some people can eat, some people can't. Darwin read this shortly before he took off on the Beagle on his famous trip. There's another guy named Wallace we're going to come across here in just a little bit. He read Thomas Malthus too. So these guys are thinking about this. Some organisms can survive and some can't as they're developing these evolutionary ideas. So at this point, Darwin enters the story. He gets credited with being the father of modern evolutionary theory. Darwin is a naturalist, so he is someone that sees God in nature. He is someone that went to medical school to be a surgeon, but couldn't stand the sight of blood. There's a story that Darwin fainted the first time he saw blood as a surgery student, and then he also went to school to be a priest and kind of flamed out there as well. And so he got an opportunity to take a trip on this boat. They were looking for a naturalist to catalog specimens. So he traveled on the Beagle. You see, they left in England. He's an English guy, and they traveled south, then west, then continued west, went back to South America, and then returned to Great Britain. Over here, they've got the Galapagos highlighted because you've probably heard that Darwin did a lot of his groundbreaking research in the Galapagos. That's where he collected a ton of his specimens. So essentially, the fact that he was prepared, the fact that he had read all of this stuff before he left, that allowed him to come up with these theories on a boat in the middle of the ocean. He didn't have to Google anything. He didn't have to go research anything. He was on a boat. He was collecting specimens, and he was looking at what he was picking up, and he was trying to figure out patterns. You've probably heard of Galapagos finches. These are the birds that Darwin encountered on the Galapagos. What's important about the finches is that they're essentially the same. They've got roughly the same body type, the same body size, roughly the same coloration patterns. Essentially, all that's different are their beaks. There are some islands in the Galapagos where it's really dry, and in those islands you see lots of cacti. Well, look at the beak on this finch. Contrast that with this insect eater that lives on a wetter island. And then look over here at the seed eater on an island that's got a rainy season and a dry season. Their beaks match their environment, sort of like the Greeks saw. Well, Darwin says maybe these weren't created for this ecosystem. Maybe they settled the ecosystem, and the birds that could eat had babies that survived. So they looked like their parents that could eat and survive. We'll leave off there. We'll pick up talking about Alfred Wallace in video 2.